Okay. As most of you know, my name is Tim Barrett. I'm one of the co-PIs on this project. I just want to let you know that it's been an absolute delight to work with Paul Dilly, Catherine Tackow, and Melissa Morton on this project. We together as a group symbolize the focus of the seminar, that is to say, scholars in dialogue with hands-on specialists. Both parties learn a lot from each other, and it's really been very important to us that we include conservators and hands-on specialists like Mark and Frau Kreutz in the seminar. Mark Barnard was formerly head of paper conservation at the British Library. He has specialized over many years on early Central and East Asian materials, including conservation of the Dunhuang paper archive, Gandharian birch bark, as well as Arabic miniature paintings. During his time, he has been involved in international projects in Tibet, People's Republic of China, Pakistan, USA, Japan, Russia, Myanmar, and in the International Dunhuang Project in London. Barnard is the co-author of a book with Francis Wood on the history and conservation of the Diamond Sutra. His most recent work has been the conservation of a paper-based entomological collections at the Natural History Museum and the ongoing conservation of an early Sanskrit birch bark manuscript. Please join me in welcoming Mark Barnard.
Well, thank you very much, Tim, for this introduction, and thank you. Oh, okay.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for the invitation to speak here this afternoon. I was going to say, I hope everyone has the stamina for this, but seeing half the people have left, I won't make any comments on that. But I'm not sure if it's the subject matter or what can I say. Anyway, it's okay. I was only joking. It's fine. As you can see from the title, it's primarily a talk about the conservation of the Diamond Sutra, which is the world's earliest dated printed. I put down book/scroll, but I've noticed it can now be referred to as a book scroll, so I think it's a new term I'm inclined to use. This was a very long project, spread over a period of about 20 years. Now, even by British Library standards, that's quite a long time, but there's a good reason for that, and the Conservation Department that I had responsibility for at the time was given a rather kind of unwelcome gift, but it was something we had to deal with. I will explain more later, but it has a bearing on not just the Diamond Sutra, but early Buddhism as well. So, shall I put the lights down? Which one is it?
The one to the right.
That one there? Okay, let's see if we can move on. Really, this talk is very much an adjunct to Susan's lovely presentation earlier. Hence, I suspect you'll notice similarities with the map. I won't zoom in on that because it's been put into a nice context now. And the historic picture of the cave complex to the left and to the right, and part of the escarpment at near Dunhuang on the upper right. I was fortunate enough to visit Dunhuang 3 years ago, and you can see beyond the construction works, the escarpment where the caves are now really haven't changed that much. Very much, if you look at the site, it suffers hugely from erosion, and you'll see in the next couple of shots how this can actually try and stabilise this. But it's an enormous issue for the site, and if you look at the construction this side, it's to try to minimise erosion and in general, because of climate change, how it's affecting these UNESCO World Heritage Sites. It's not just what's inside the cave complex, it's the immediate environment as well, because of the shift in sand and the erosion through sand, and you notice the trees acting as a barrier to try to minimise the damage on the actual site itself. Getting closer to the fabled library cave, Cave 17, shows you little bits of the rebuilding that's taken place to kind of face the cave complex itself. And of course it allows public access to the caves. And again, you can see the scaffolding at the end there, where it's ongoing construction work, ongoing stabilisation work. And this fits in nicely with how Susan described it earlier, the very famous picture of Pelio. This is within the Cave 17, the library cave, and this kind of slightly eerily lit part is the cave, which I believe is right, isn't it? So where the presumed that the scrolls were, and you can see just beyond that dark, the dark doorway. That is actually where the scrolls were actually found and stored, moved from and returned. And a historic photograph of the actual cave itself, and very little has changed. It's amazing. I mean, this was taken about 1900, and it's still pretty much as it is in this photograph. It's kind of extraordinary that if you consider what the history that's what's passed in the last 100 years, that what we actually have there is still very, very intact now. This is very interesting. The bottom right-hand side, we believe, is one of the bundles of possibly of the sutras. But what's significant really about this is the photograph, the upper photograph to the right, and that's the first image we have of the Diamond Sutra. And when you look at that, it's kind of significant, and I'll talk more about this later, is that it shows you the frontispiece. But I don't know if you can remember from the shot we saw earlier how it's very clean. This is very heavily stained, and then, as I asked earlier, what was the actual starting point for this project? And that was one of the starting points, is basically what happened to the stain. It sounds very prosaic, but it is something that took many, many years to understand for reasons I'll explain later. And out of the, I think is it the 50,000 items or so? Remind me how many printed scrolls there were, or printed items? So I think that actually puts the rarity of the printed material that came out of Dunhuang. And out of those 30 items, I think there are three scrolls, 3 or 4 scrolls. So very, very small number, very, very precious. And of course, what sets this one, the Dharma Sutra, apart from the others is not just the frontispiece, but in fact it's actually it's dated. It has a set date. Okay, on popular demand, we're looking at this again now. So I don't know if we can see anything more from than last time. I can vaguely remember that there's a canvas chair. I don't know if anyone can spot that, but it's such an iconic image. It's and it can be viewed and enjoyed more than once. Not sure if I can see anything else there. Anyone spot anything interesting? Fresco?
On the wall behind you.
Oh, that's true. That's very true. I don't want to look at the crushed silk paintings. That's too distressing for words.
The dimension of the room.
Yeah.
Is that kind of tall?
Yeah, I think it is. It's about 12 feet, something like that, I think. It's not that deep, I think.
Yeah, it's 2 foot, yeah, it's probably about 10, 12 feet.
Yeah. But when considering that, as mentioned earlier, that Stein had been there and removed a significant number of scrolls, it's kind of mind-blowing just how much there is still there. And I think that's really one of the most kind of significant things in the image. I was there 5 days ago, so I thought I'd just, as a reminder, this is where the material ended up in London in 1911. Needless to say, it hasn't really changed much, apart from there's far more tourists there now than there was then. And I thought that was just quite a nice picture. So, of no consequence at all. We could discuss the vertical nature of the Corinthian columns and how they cheat the vertical by swelling out or putting out the centre of the column, but that's too much of a tangent, I think. This is interesting. This is the King's, what formerly was known as the King's Library. Now it has a different use. As the British Library was formed, the King's Library was moved out of the British Museum into the new British Library building. But this is where the Diamond Sutra, along with a number of other significant items from Stein's expedition, were put on public display. Unfortunately, after the 1918 war, a lot of these items, and the Diamond Sutra being one, was actually left on display for a very, very long period of time. And it's interesting what Miriam noted with the role of papyrus, how, if you remember, one of the panels, as she said, had been bleached. And that's actually a very key word, and it was very much the case with the Diamond Sutra, as you'll see later, that what we weren't sure about is, one, how long it had been actually on display for. And there's less understanding then about the damage that occurs to material when they are on, I hate to use the word permanent display, but if you can see the amount of light coming in, it's a very light gallery. There's less understanding about the effect of ultraviolet light on material, the deterioration that can cause. And in some parts of the gallery, you do get direct sunlight falling on material. And that had contributed, or has contributed, to the light damage of quite a number of items. Ooh, sorry. Yep. Okay. And so from the Stein collection had moved around, but the Diamond Sutra has actually continued to be on display in the British Museum up until about 92, I think it was, so a very long period of time. And this, we recognise, this is the British Library building, where the British Museum Library, British Museum collections are now housed and obviously referred to as the British Library. And it's, what can I say, state-of-the-art building that enjoys very, very stable environmental conditions for the collections that are now housed there. Right, so image top left, as we've just seen, and the large image to the right. Can you see the difference? And there's been a kind of any number of changes, and it takes a little time to actually have a look here. You can see the red dot here, and there's areas of misalignment here, and that point has been a strange shift. But the most significant change is actually the fact that this heavy stem is now not present at all, and needless to say, we have some rather nasty looking paper borders there, and this ghastly white border here that really doesn't enhance it in any way at all. So yes, when did the project start? And in many ways it was looking afresh at the Diamond Sutra. It had been noted that it had been on display a long time. People have become concerned about it. And it's not until we tried to find out a bit about its conservation history, which involved finding earlier images, that we actually found that there had been this significant change. Now, the staining is quite easy to explain. Originally, the scroll, along with a lot of other scrolls of this period, is dyed yellow. I won't go too much into the nature of the yellow dye, but the dye itself is very fugitive. And so at some point, it suffered from water damage, the dye has bled, and it's formed a very heavy tide mark. So that accounts or explains the stain. But there's another point which we have here. If you look very carefully, can you see this white area here? between the sparkly and here, it actually isn't present there. That is because the frontispiece, at some point, we think quite early on, had actually been cut off from the scroll. And the reason it had been removed from the main text panel, we think, is that it may have been exhibited as a print rather than a scroll, meaning a flat print that would have had a date. So it would have been seen as the world's earliest dated block print, as a pictorial image, rather than a scroll. It's quite an interesting way of looking at things. We can't criticise it, but it's a fact that it had been cut off. And because of that, it's quite possible that the first conservation treatment may well have been carried out in the prints and drawings department of the British Museum. Because we think it had been transferred there for a period of time. Whether it's a temporary thing, I'm not sure. Conservation records are pretty scant. Tried very hard to find information on that. Nothing at all. So from the image to the left, it had been cut, and it's at that point the first lining was added. So, but we don't know whether or not it was actually washed at that point. Now, if it went to a prints and drawings department, there is quite established conservation methods for the removal of heavy stains of discoloration, because you're looking at, what you want is a clean image, not one sullied by a heavy stain that isn't seen as particularly pleasant to look at. And those treatments tend to use bleaches. And this was really one of the first points that we had to research. Chloramine T is one. There's other form of bleaches that can be used. Potassium permanganate can be used in combination with bleach. And it's this type of cocktail of chemicals that we were potentially most concerned about. But you think it's a comparatively easy thing to find residues, but it isn't. It really wasn't. I'll talk a little more about that later, but it's absolutely fascinating, but also extremely worrying. So why did it take 20 years? That was one of the first points we had to deal with, is to try and determine what had actually happened to it. We can see the obvious physical changes, like the borders here. You can't just about see that, this border here, and the edge there, and the extra linings that have been put on, because of the nature of the scroll, it's quite badly cracked. They thought that the more linings you put on, the stronger it becomes, the more stable it is. In fact, it's the opposite. The more you put on, the more unstable it becomes, especially when something in a physical scroll form, as you can imagine, from the narrow core, when it comes off the roller, very, very tightly rolled. It's 25 foot long. And so it puts a tremendous stress on paper that's nearly 1,200 years old. And the fibre distribution, the fibre type, is very short. And so it splits and cracks very, very, very easily. Okay. And leading on from that, this explains it here. Can you see these areas here where that peak? That's very typical of what happens towards the inner part of the scroll, where the pressure of the lining pushes the weakness of the scroll up, and the effect is these hard, sharp, vertical breaks. You get it to a lesser extent on the front of it. You can see how it's a little more shallow. It's a softer shading in these areas here. But here it's harsh. And when you magnify beyond this point, at these peaks, you can actually see little tufts of fibre, which you don't want to see. Now, a lot of current conservation thinking is you can, in a sense, stabilise it, digitise by preservation. In other words, you can digitise, restrict the use of the original, and then only offer a digital image. And that is, of course, one approach. But there's always going to be demand for something as significant as this. And it's well worth remembering that although the British Library is the kind of custodian of the scroll, it is a World Heritage item, and it's particularly important, obviously, to China, for all the very, very obvious reasons. So you have to be seen as a kind of responsible custodian of this material. And when it is viewed and it's seen like that, it really is not acceptable. So for any number of reasons, we made that decision to fully research the condition of the scroll, and then to consider a conservation approach that would stabilize it and allow us to handle it and understand it more in the future. I don't know if Tim's here, but you are, Tim. Right, fibre distribution. When you compare the quality of the paper with the Diamond Sutra and the classical period, which we would refer to as like the 4th to the 6th century paper production, this is far more crude. It's a very different paper fibre for a start. It's a pure paper mulberry rather than a highly refined hemp. But it tends to suggest that the nature of the paper was evolving for the use it was going to be put to, because this isn't paper that has to accept ink in a very fluid form for calligraphy. This is paper that was being developed and very early on for printing. And as we know, paper for printing and paper for calligraphy has very different natures. One of strength, of absorbency, of the ability, especially in printing, to register over the block without splitting. And it's very interesting to note that these are quite early developments of paper technology for printing. But it's not that good because the fibre distribution is very uneven. Daisy. And you can see in areas like this, it's very thin. And here, it's not that well processed, so it clumps. But it did work, it did register. So the print from the block is very clear. And that's using transmitted light. And you can see there, it's scary just how thin it is. Now, that gave us a massive problem because if you can imagine that you have very thin paper with numerous paper linings with very heavy adhesives. And so that was another area of research, how you actually remove paper in an aqueous form and the adhesive without disturbing the original and without losing any further dye. After we removed the first paper lining, and I show a little more detail how we went about that, one of the wonderful things that came to light, although it looks deadly boring here, is this. I know. What is it? It's the evidence of the block print. So even after XX number of linings and hammering it out, and goodness only knows what, it shows you that the memory of the initial printing is still present in the paper. So it has it does have a three-dimensional nature in a few areas. But it's very interesting also that the tradition of scroll mounting, I won't go too much into that, but scroll mounting usually means adding paper to the original. And this is something we really wanted to avoid, because if you then added a lining to that, you start losing this evidence. It's much more difficult to then look at the fibre distribution, to carry out novel research onto the item, because it's just the front. It's just looking at the front, but it's a three-dimensional object. So we were very, very reluctant to go along that path of removing linings only to reline, even though the East Asian tradition is one of lining. It's a very strong and immensely skilled in China, Japan and Korea. And we had to kind of steer a middle way while understanding the tradition and materials used in classical scroll mounting. We were not going to go the route of adding paper to the Diamond Sutra, or adding a lining, I should say. We will add paper to strengthen it, but not to fully cover the sutra itself. Right, so work in action. This is the start of the actual conservation process that we have here. I know this very well because I spent a very long time looking through this and working on this area. You see little tabs here, little areas here. These are very, very thin pieces of toned paper that just act as a support on the areas of the scroll that are fractured. No more than that. 2 layers are added to give sufficient support and alignment, but not enough to build up or cause undue resistance when the sheet is flexed. And this one, explain this. This sheet here is a tracing of the damage. So every area here is a fracture or an area of loss or wear, and every part of that has to be strengthened. So it's done in 20 centimetre areas, so this part has been worked on. This is the next area here between these 2 strips. If you can see white strips here, these are basically holding the scroll together. I should say that when we started on this, the frontispiece was separated from the main body of the scroll. We always laugh at this and say we saved the best till last. That wasn't really the case, but it's one of building up the skill base and understanding to then work on the frontispiece. And also the scroll, as I say, is 25 feet long, so it's a lot of work to get to the point when you actually work onto the frontispiece. I think that kind of very clearly illustrates the process and what's actually involved, where we speak, realign. Can you see the tabs there? It's all pulled together, but hopefully they're not visually intrusive when you actually look at the scroll itself. They're visible, but not visibly intrusive. These areas are fractures that have been held together temporarily with these light paper strips. But you can see the difference. Once it's joined together, how much more stable the sheet looks to the right. And that is only because of the realignment of the actual panel itself. And that's really a detail of it. Can you see then from this point here how the paper blends in with the original? But we always need to see it. It always needs to be visible. It's very important. And these areas here have to be drawn together. But this is something where you have to consider the kind of risks involved and how much you can actually do that, because it's not always possible to actually draw everything together. One area you can realign, but then you may find you transfer that stress by a realignment in one area to a different part of the sheet. So there's quite a number of considerations you have to make when you take this on. And this one is very interesting in as much that this is getting very close to the frontispiece, and we're using a historic photograph of the missing area in the paper bit, so that it's actually happening. When it was actually removed, a very small amount of the scroll was lost. Can you see it? That's right there. So it's a matter of using historical images to inform the correct alignment of the scroll. And this is really the phase that we started through, just to recap. The bottom left shows the border which was removed. That was border taken up from the edge, reducing that. And then that's before we had came over, and that's been removed at that point there. And this was when the early patches, because it had been repaired in antiquity using a very heavy glue, and you can see the amount of distortion which had taken place at these ridges here. And it was a very, very thick glue, and that really had to be removed. And like an advent calendar. This was all on the same point, an appropriate day now. Where are we now? Number 2? The second day? So, but what this showed was the number of layers that had been put onto the frontispiece. So rather than removing old linings, so we know that the scroll had been lined up to 5 times, and the frontispiece had retained all the linings. The main body of the scroll had the linings removed, and that was one of the major challenges, is to basically make a decision on how far we would go and whether or not the risks involved justified the removal of all the linings. This is the process of removing the first or second lining, I think it's the second lining actually. So it's been humidified, and you see that has been drawn back, but you can see from here we still have 2 further linings shown. And of course, the closer you get to the original, the greater the, I wouldn't say risk, but the greater the moisture penetration is, and the fact whether or not you make that decision to go any further to remove them. Just as an example of what's lost with linings, I mean, this was one that we worked on at around the same time, and this had been heavily lined, and took the linings off, and this is what you have. What is it called, Sue? Oh, thank you.
Or stencil.
Or stencil, I suppose it is. What is short of it? Yeah. It's great. I mean, that was lost, and so it's not always appropriate to add linings, and especially when you do lose evidence of its intended purpose. Right, so linings removed, and this is where it became slightly complicated, where this is underneath here, this is the actual, this is the frontispiece, and there were numerous patches put over these historic areas. This was historic loss. We could tell that from the original photograph. But this is why it tends to suggest that it may have gone to the prints and drawings department, because I think it was a form of kind of clever restoration. They reused old patches to disguise loss, but it made it very difficult for us to determine what was original and what was an original later repair, and then the considerations on do you remove them or not. We decided to, because they were inaccurately placed, and the adhesive used was such that it was making it very brittle, so we thought it was very much the thing to do to remove it, but retain it. And it's worth noting that everything that has been removed from the scroll has been retained as part of the archive of the conservation and the archive for the for future generations. It's very important to retain all evidence. This just shows in a sense, the humidification process. Here we have, this is feeding a little bit of ultrasonic moisture. And what that does over a period of time, the paper absorbs it, and we can measure the humidity within that this area here is that the zigzags are lifting the mylar sheet off the scroll. If that were touching it, you get capillary action and it would suck and pull the paper up. And you can see it's angled this area here, where the ultrasonic mist comes in. And over about a 2-hour period, you slowly control the humidity, which gives you a window of opportunity to start to realign mid areas. So, unbelievably, these do pull together. But the judgment is very important. You have to make sure that you know that by drawing that together, you're not going to cause stress elsewhere. And everything has to be, you consider after a period of time, and it's just down to experience and how much you can do. And of course, because we're working in this way, you can't always tell the correct alignment, even though transmitted light. And so sometimes you have to stop, turn over, realign, and we introduce moisture until such time as the alignment the characters is correct. Yes, so it's very important underneath that is a cold light source, because you don't want to introduce any heat at all. It is a cold, very, very slow process. This was a kind of scary moment. Getting to removing the final layer and what appears to be a complete image of the Buddha. In fact, was nearly complete, but unfortunately there's a little bit near the eye. And every time we drew that line, you had a little bit of light coming out, which became very disconcerting, as if it's the eye of the Buddha looking at you with this bright light. But what it was, we found out that this is why it goes back to, we think that it was a Prints and Drawings restoration, that there was loss, there had been historic loss, and there was a watercolour restoration over this area, and it took a long time to be absolutely 100% sure that when that final lining was removed, we weren't taking a part of the Buddha's eyebrow away. But when you look at it now, you can just about see that this is actually split at this point. But this area here, little bits of loss to it, that have now been realigned. So it's very gratifying that these areas now don't gape in this way. But I remember that I'm always going to remember this moment, and putting it down and walking around a bit and then revisiting it and having colleagues to give their opinion. But it was interesting to say the least. This is another area of reconstruction, or realignment, I should say. Can we see here the halo? How the halo is distorted and lost, twisted. This was carried out, we think, with the second lining was added, so it really did distort the image, and there was a lot of loss. And these areas here creasing, folding, and now we can see you see how that's been realigned? The historic loss there. This tab across there is a temporary tab that just keeps the various areas together. When this has been fully strengthened, that's then removed. And it's such a light adhesive used on that. There's no adhesive residue left on the face at all. And this is showing infilling of an area that we know was lost through the early image using a very similar style paper. You would hope to be able to say it's Chinese paper we would use, or it's a Chinese scroll, obviously Chinese paper mulberry, but there hasn't been a tradition in China for the last, well, many hundreds of years to produce high quality paper mulberry. It's not available at all. So we have to be pragmatic, and over a period of about 10 years, we have many colleagues in Japan, and we were able to source paper that was absolutely similar in all respects to the paper mulberry here. So although we use what's called Japanese paper, the characteristics of that paper are so close to the original, we have no qualms about actually using that. And in many ways, a lot of the tradition of Japanese paper making, some of it, especially paper mulberry, would have been from the Chinese tradition. So it's really protecting a tradition that is now lost in China, that is still continuing in Japan. And Tim will be the person who knows all about that. But it's very interesting. But again, that's another reason why the project took so long, is that one, you have to be totally confident when you do interventive work, you add materials, that you're using absolutely the best material possible. And a small thing, doesn't seem much, but it's kind of interesting. One to the left, this is a border. This was how it was when it came out of the cave. So historically, it had been torn and it had been realigned incorrectly. And then, for some kind of bizarre reason, it was done again, but they thought it went above. In fact, it should be like that. And when you get the alignment right here, it's amazing how many other areas then fit into place, because there was a whole shift of the image. One thing wrong, and everything else was misaligned. One thing right, and it goes back into place. Right. Okay. Enough of the Diamond Sutra for the time being. I mentioned that we had a nasty surprise, a nasty gift from our colleagues in the Asian library. I don't know if anyone can interpret what you're looking at there. It's the Gandharan scroll, and it was literally given to us. Okay, guys, would you do something with it? And got a little fancy cotton wool top, just to make things even better. And the glossy, the glossy appearance is not one of Miriam's categories of papyrus. It's actually hair lacquer added to stabilise the scroll. Thank you very much. So yes, we were asked as a matter of urgency to deal with this kind of interesting project. Had to be dealt with, but no questions asked. So it came in, I think about 15 scrolls, in these jars, and they were Pakistani pickle jars, and it's a very good way for transit. It makes it very secure. Anyway, they eventually, by various convoluted routes, came into London and eventually ended up in the library. So the first stage was to actually open up the jar. So I had to cut open, and that's what, looking down, these, how clear these are. Depth of field is a bit funny on this, but it is a scroll that had literally been pushed into the jar, and a little bit of cotton wool for protection. And our brief was, well, can you open it up, please? So yes, okay, we will. So what we had to do is to draw it out, and using methods that we have used for papyrus, and that is very slow humidification. Draw it out. Now, at the time, we were told, look, never mind, you're going to get some loss. It doesn't matter. We're not quite sure what it is, although there was a suspicion of what it was. It comes from the borders of Afghanistan and Pakistan, so we had a pretty good guess of the material, so it's Gandharan material, and there's an indication of where the site was, and the site was very early, so all of a sudden there's a lot of interest. But it's what we have is, you can see the main body of the scroll, and you can see a very sharp crease there. Now that wasn't because it was pushed into a pickle jar, it's because that would have shattered it. It was because it had been placed into a terracotta vessel that was used as a reliquary, we believe, along with some bone of a monk. But usually these things are found or looked for because of gold. So this was, in a sense, a miraculous survivor. I can't go into whether it's a good thing or bad thing, but anyway, it has survived, and now there is an interest in this material. But it survived because I think about a couple of years before these came into the library, quite a prominent London collector had actually purchased something similar, similar material, not similar period, but on different material. So it had set a benchmark market price for this material. And because of that, then there was more care when these things are found. But the trouble is, the trade-off is that these are unofficial excavations, and we all know things come out without provenance. The sites can be devastated because of this. So it cuts both ways. The material survives because there is a market for it, but the very market may well be destroying the material. It's a bit of a conundrum, but can't go any further than that, other than we were asked to deal with it. And there we are. It's similar to the picture that Susan showed earlier. You can see where the original fold was. Yeah. And I think it is actually this one is unbelievably, it stands at the moment, it's the world's earliest Buddhist manuscript. That's why I showed it alongside not just the fact that making an apology for the length of time for the Diamond Sutra project, its juxtaposition with the Diamond Sutra is quite extraordinary to deal with both things together. And I don't think that's changed. So it's about mid-1st century AD. And we know that it's been quite securely dated, not because of any dates on the manuscript itself, but in this case there was a lot of debris, and the decision was made to C14 carbon dated. Contentious issue, but it was literally debris without any writing at all, and the decision was made in this case because it thought it would advance the scholarship of this collection to date it. And I think Richard Solomon, when he's here, I think in a couple of months' time, will no doubt be talking a little more about that, so I won't say any more than that. But it's fascinating. So introducing that from the conservator's perspective. It's birch bark. Yeah. So it's yes, and it's we say the thickness of it, but it's a few microns thick. Yeah, small point. If you talk about thickness, it actually gives us a problem because when you have one or two areas, ridges, it increases the thickness, and this is literally held between a particular quality of glass. Because as soon as you try and secure it in any way at all, even if you use a very soft paper or a very, very light adhesive, it's still inherently stronger than the material itself. And so this is one where we're absolutely determined you minimize the handling, and in this case, digitization is the best possible course. You stabilize it, put it between glass, you store it well, in other words, you control your temperature and humidity, absolutely minimize the handling, and then digitize it, and for scholarship, it's the best way forward. The only trouble is, as we know, the movement forward of digital technology, there's always then the pressure to take it out and re-digitize it. And in my knowledge, it's already been done 3 times. So what can you say? What can you do? But it's even so, it's still the best form of preservation is to try to restrict the use of the original and to digitize and offer high quality digital images. And yeah, I think Jim can maybe be talking about this in more depth later, but just as an interest, the birch bark as it would appear, as it would have been on the left, and before it's been processed and stripped to the right. And we run to the left. It's only a couple of weeks old, so you can see how similar it is in condition to the original, or the one I showed you earlier. But it becomes a lot more brittle. The older it becomes, the more brittle it becomes. There's very little fibre in it to give it any integral strength. Right. Tools of the trade. A mixed bag of things. What's familiar to most of you. This is kind of fun. This is a very nice little Chinese brush we tend to use. Classical Kyoto style paste brush. From various friends and colleagues. This was made by a colleague of mine in China, and these are slightly, in the set of these, slightly scary dentistry tools from Russia. And I won't show you the whole kit. It's really too much. And tweezers and little bits and pieces and brushes. And just a selection of stone papers to the left. Getting close to the end now. It was quite a decision about the final format of the Diamond Sutra. It could be rolled. There's enough strength in it to roll it, but we felt that there's very little gain through the ability to open and close it. Most access would involve wanting to see the frontispiece, which is obviously at the front, but the colophon with the date is the inner part, and so it would mean moving back and forwards. And this one is about a similar period of time. So there are two in the collection that are still in scroll format, meaning all the panels are joined. So the only difference between the Diamond Sutra and the sutra here, which I should say is a printed sutra, is that the final assembly hasn't taken place, which means that the panels haven't been tipped together, and the sutra is kept flat. So if it needs to be viewed, it's taken out and viewed as a flat single sheet. And there are 6 text panels and the frontispiece itself. I mean, it can change, but I don't know your thoughts about it, Susan. Has there been any comments about the format of it now?
No, I think it'd be nice to walk some point to workshop to discuss it.
Yeah, it's something. Yeah,
Right.
it's not a final decision. It's something that one of format.
It's very helpful when we lent it to get it.
Yeah.
So you to take that.
That's it. You see, that's an important part, isn't it?
Well, yes, but if they got lost,
Yeah. Kind of incomplete. Yeah. Right, looks like something's burning a hole in it. Rest assured it's not. But because it's now it doesn't have its linings, and we are able to research it, and this is using quite a standard analytical tool now to remote analysis. So it's a low-powered laser. It can give you element analysis, and we were using this to try to follow, and we can't quite see it, but we used a tracing of the original stain, and we were taking readings to see whether or not there's any residue of potassium or anything else when we did before we actually started on the removal of the linings. So going back to where I earlier on, to try to do as much research as possible on this, and this was one of the tools we tried to use, but it was still inconclusive. So we sampled about 50-60 points on the frontispiece, followed by other areas which have all been recorded, and there was no discernible difference in the analysis we were getting from the points where the former stain was than the other areas. So we could deduce from that we were 95% sure that it hadn't been bleached. So that was kind of reassuring. So it was simply a matter of washing and light exposure that had caused the lightening of the image. And we started out also by replicating the stain, and literally for about 5 years putting a sample out, replicating the sun damage to a historic fragment. And it was surprising just how much was lost through the effect of light, and sunlight in particular. High UV really did affect the actual density of the colour and the apparent bleaching of the image. Very quickly, this is quite current research, looking, as Susan mentioned earlier, from our Japanese colleagues, using transmitted light and a digital microscope, and it very classical image of paper mulberry fibres here. And looking at fibre distribution, here, which we've seen already. These showing areas of, I shouldn't use the word contaminants, but things that have been found within the sheets. So we have some silk thread, a little bit of hemp fibre here, and looking more analysis of the roller and mapping of the position of these pieces. So it's questionable whether these were additives in the making of the paper, or whether it's basically material that found their way into the vat during the paper making process. I'm not sure. And again, a little more detail of the paper, individual paper fibres, and the distribution and measurements of the fibres and the density of the fibre. Part process fibres here, and this is the silk, and it's the weave, which Professor Enemy has said that he thought was an extremely high quality, but it's highly unlikely that silk was added. But we don't know. We don't know. But it's interesting that the material that has been found, he said, was of extremely high quality. Right, and finally, back to where we started. Completed frontispiece. I'll just point out one thing. These little pieces here now have been removed, so they were left just to illustrate all the small areas that have been infilled. So the layers have now been finished off. And this is a note. We've added a little border to the left and right to give a greater balance to the image, because originally it would have extended across, but when the panels are joined, one is always cut, one is cropped for the colour. So this has been reintroduced, and then the wrapper we put in there. And this area is slightly exaggerated, slightly wider than it should be, but it allows us to lay it next to the first set of panels. So I think that is it. Okay. Yes.
Of course.
Okay.
So I was really amazed by the detail about the you have with this conservation.
Yeah.
And you talked about retaining everything that's been removed,
Yes.
etc. Can you talk about the sort of fullness of this like archival process that you go into the whole conservation of something like this?
Yeah, certainly. So it's all the material that we found through our research. And so that is looking into the documentation in the British Museum Centre for Conservation. So it was looking at that. The prints and drawings department. So that's as far back as we could go from when it came into the library. Susan may know more about Stein's records, but we could never really find anything, could we? It really was utterly frustrating. You would have thought for something as significant as the Dhan Sutra, there would be more references to it, yet we couldn't find them. And then the main body of work is all the conservation that had been carried out, dare I say, since the mid-50s. So everything that's been added from that point on, which is linings on the back, there's rather unsightly borders. Everything that was added that has now been taken away has been kept. So literally everything that was on the sutra has been kept, plus the documentation of the where all the fractures are. So you can get a lot of information through photographic evidence, of course, before and after shots. But it's surprising that it's not always that helpful if you want to record intricate creases or folds and light fractures. So every panel has been drawn. So on archival paper with all the stress marks, fractures, and everything that has been carried out on it, and it's kept as a full archive. Plus notes and even meetings and decision making and no, that's an interesting point actually. I could archive them, I suppose, if I wish to. I'll think about that one. Yeah, that's right. Yes, yeah, that's right. Yes. Yeah, that's exactly, yes. They have a pattern about them. I have to think about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I have a couple of questions. One is about the Gandhara manuscript in the pickle bottle.
Yeah.
Was that part of your Solomon project on the rhinoceros?
It certainly was.
Mark, can you repeat the question into the mic?
Yeah, certainly. Sorry, it was about the Gandhara and Koroshti scroll and whether it was part of Richard Solomon's Rhinoceros Sutra project.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yes.
Yeah, my other question, I guess, about all the work that's going on time with Sutra is really amazing. I think. Are you working with somebody or somebody using that material for the critical edition of time with Sutra? Or what's going on?
I'm not sure, Susan. Do you know if anyone else is working on this at the moment? Not at the moment.
No, there's been lots of work done.
Yes.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Yes, so there's a lot of that by
Agnieszka.
No, I'm just thinking of the textual scholar.
Ah.
Yes.
Yes, by the guy whose name will come back to me when I reach on
But
yeah.
he'll be using this material.
Or
he will be, or something like that.
well, he's looking at the text, so he's not so interested in all conservation material.
Yeah,
That's
right.
a different sort of,
I mean, I'm a textualist, and for me to look at your conservation process is very valuable.
yeah.
Thank you.
It's all there, and yeah.
Yeah, let's give you one example. If you talk about conservation, it was. I don't know if anyone has, too much knowledge about measurement of pH, but it's a very important measurement that conservators, not just conservators, but people use. But one of the things we wanted to try to determine if it had been bleached, for instance,
By whom?
by the prints and drawings department as part of their standard method of. It's still done today. I mean, it's all over the world. People still bleach Western prints and drawings. It's a standard procedure. I mean, I won't comment, but it is. And it would have been then, especially in 1910.
Yeah, this is one of my main things is now is I've discovered how much of your work is really correct. Your work
Absolutely. But 19, that is absolutely right. But this was one of the projects, and I could have spoken at length about these. But one was incredibly interesting, and what we thought one of the most or the easiest ways of determining whether something had been bleached, because of the alkaline nature of bleach, is to determine the pH value. Now, you would have thought that would have been a logical way forward. But it's interesting because the dye used in the Diamond Sutra and historically within a lot of the Dunhuang material is a very acidic dye. So it has a low pH, but then traditional thinking is a low pH can actually affect paper fibres in a detrimental way. But we know that isn't the case with these. But anyway, putting that aside, what we wanted to try to do is measure, and you would have thought it would have been easier. So one part of the scroll hasn't been touched, one part possibly been bleached. So you can measure pH in one panel, go to the frontispiece, and all of a sudden you find that it's something like pH of 10, and the average is pH of 4. So yes, the indication is it's been bleached, unless it has an anti-chlorine which would have affected that. But anyway, it's not a simple process, because when you measure pH, you measure it usually in solution. In other words, you have to extract basically product. You add moisture, you extract moisture, the solution then is measured. But even the measurement itself is actually very complex to get an accurate pH measurement of a solution. So one of the projects we tried to, it did work to a point, was a micro probe that would measure pH using the ambient, I call it ambient, but the present RH in the scroll. So if, for instance, the scroll is, which it is, it's stored at around 50%, the micro probe would give you a reading based on the ambient RH. But it never got beyond the experimental stage of one reading per tip, and the manufacture of the tip was so complicated. Do you remember Alan Kennedy? It was fantastic, and we were looking forward to this. But it was one thing having it work in the lab. It was quite another thing to actually work on the material itself, and we were never able to do it. But it took time. And it was a great PhD. That's fantastic. But that was 3 years. Yeah. But it's just one of a number of projects that novel methods of measurement in this case.
Probably got dozens of PhDs waiting to be done right in your lab.
There were three. Three. Yeah. That accounts for 9-10 years. And then if you add the Gandhara material, hey, it's done in 5 years. Not so bad.
I have perhaps an unfair question for you and Susan both. Based on your knowledge of the collection, what is really out of the blue? Kate would suggest that they really some kind of.
Oh, Susan can answer that. Paper-based codex in China.
Well, 9th century, maybe 8th. I mean, that's what we've got from what we see.
All right, that's great.
Any further questions?
That's such a dramatic stain front.
Yes.
Here's another speculation, or question for you. When did that aqueous stain from? When was it produced?
We don't know. It could have been any time from the period that the scroll, along with the other material, was stored in the cave. And I mean, it could have been, or it could have been before that. Yeah.
We don't have
No.
water damage in the tree.
No.
So
No.
probably during its lifetime.
Yeah, because it's quite interesting. It looked like as if it was a very stubborn stain, but also the fact that the scroll had been quite heavily used and had been patched in antiquity, so it was worn and damaged before it was actually put into the cave.
It seems miraculous that it proved so ephemeral. It's dangerous.
I know. What can I say?
That happy note.
Shall I? How can I comment on that? Or in other words, let's discuss at some stage. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.